Digital Policy Analyst at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Welcome for being here in the Parliament. We started a bit later because there was apparently quite a congestion at the entrance with the security because of all the events that are happening today. We have a very big room, so yeah, it's good to sit in the front and maybe a bit in the middle to be a bit close if you can. I will do a bit the practical housekeeping, and then it's up to the speakers to open the conference. For the speakers, I would ask you, if you go to the stage, could you take your name plate, because that's useful. Then we can see also on the recording who's speaking, and on the photos. On the other hand, we have quite a busy schedule. If there's any questions, you can come to me or the team that's sitting on the right-hand side for practical questions. And with that, I would like to give the floor to the Vice President of the S&D Group, Alex Arias-Saliba, to open the conference. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and first of all, good morning, everyone. I am really looking forward for today's very interesting discussions, very interesting panels that we have, touching upon the most vital, the most important points when it comes to our digital ambitions, what we have done during these past 4.5 years, super busy 4.5 years, and very ambitious 4.5 years, but we have a lot of work in front of us. The digital revolution is turning the world upside down by creating new opportunities, but at the same time by creating many new challenges that are ultimately affecting our citizens, our people's lives. A lot has happened during these past 4 years in digital policy. The regulatory agenda of the European Commission resulted in flagship proposals such as the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, that have already been adopted, and also the AI Act and the Platform Work Directive, which are currently at trialogue. We are at this point doing a marathon of trialogue negotiations on the AI Act, which have started yesterday at 3. They are still ongoing. The latest information that we have is that we are still very far behind in getting an agreement during this open-ended negotiations. Hopefully, Brando can tap us in on what is happening during these negotiations, what we have achieved, because we already have achieved a lot, especially when it comes to protecting our workforce in the AI ecosystems. When efficiently enforced, these groundbreaking pieces of legislation will establish, I must say, a new constitution for our digital age that is fair, that is transparent, and most importantly for all, that is accountable for all. We started this whole journey with a digital Wild West where these big tech platforms were ultimately dictating and moving by their own rules, and ultimately we took some control, but it is definitely not enough. And I am proud that the Socialists and Democrats have been in the driving seat for these critical digital initiatives, and as a political family, we were leading the conversations on many of these pieces of legislation for an inclusive digital Europe that can improve our citizens' well-being, turning technical progress into social progress for all. However, our work in the digital policy is far from over. Despite the progress that we have achieved, significant obstacles still remain. And what has been done will not be enough to match the challenges that the digital transition poses for our European communities, democracy, for our welfare state, for our economies. And that is why we are happy today that we are here. First of all, to take account of what has happened, of the current digital transitions, and also to set a roadmap for future progressive digital priorities. Today, during these exciting panels that we have, which S&D is proudly organizing together with FEPS, we will be discussing various relevant and also crucial topics from the world of work to until pan-European public digital infrastructures. Today we will discuss on how to break out of a world of work where technology is further exacerbating power imbalances between workers and their employers. Then we will look at the monopoly and the power of big tech firms that turn the work and data of millions of creators, of millions of citizens, into privately controlled AI services. We will also discuss long-term public investment and green and digital industrial strategies that can help us to align the digital transformation with progressive values, democracy, and social justice. Last, we will look at pan-European public digital infrastructures and services. Citizens and workers must reap the benefits of digital technologies while strengthening our democracies, economies, and our social fabric. To this end, we need to be able to redistribute wealth and value in the digital economy, ensuring that the digital transition does not worsen or create new and further inequalities. We must invest in public digital infrastructures and technologies, training, research, and digital tools like AI. We also must defend workers' rights in the digital economy, from platform work to the right to disconnect, to precarious positions and new forms of dumping, which for us are totally unacceptable. It is also paramount for the EU to swiftly close at all dimensions on the digital gap, from access to the internet as a fundamental right, ensuring proper access, literacy, and the use of e-services by all. Digital citizenship, data sovereignty, privacy-centric data infrastructure, and also meaningful engagement are essential to position Europe as a competitive, resilient, strategically autonomous actor that draws strength from its founding democratic principles and values. The EU can be the engine of a cooperative global effort to advance human-centered digital technologies, knowledge, and also applications designed to tackle society's biggest challenges. Still, to do that, we need to be ambitious. We need to be holistic in our strategy, showing leadership and putting forward a bold vision rooted in the public interest, where technologies aligned with democratic values form an integral part of a broader societal effort at promoting social and environmental justice to reduce inequalities. To this end, I hope that today's full day of conference will act as a catalyst, bringing together progressive political parties, labor unions, civil society organizations, academia, and also public institutions across media, culture, and arts, united in their commitment to shape democratic digitalization for Europe, to ensure that digital rights and principles safeguarded in the EU leave no one behind and offer the same opportunities for everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Alex. Next speaker is Laszlo Andor, the Secretary General of FEPS.
Thank you very much. Good morning, distinguished members of the European Parliament, dear friends. The Foundation for European Progressive Studies is here to serve the Socialists and Democrats with policy analysis and policy advice. We have been working on a number of issues in the fields of digital policy and society, especially platform work in the recent years with cross-country studies and more. And you will find some of the very interesting publications we brought with ourselves outside the room. So if you haven't yet picked up FEPS publications in this field, there is hopefully some which will meet your interest. Currently, FEPS is also working on a large multi-annual research program which we developed together with Nordic foundations, and we will obviously endeavor in spreading the fruits of this cooperation with everyone else in the European Union to ensure that the Nordics, who are pioneers, if they find something relevant in the analysis of their economic and social and to some extent political transformation as a result of digital technology, this is going to be shared with others. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that our life and work has already been transformed by digital technology. If you count how many digital tools you have with yourself or in your bag, it's probably in half a dozen, and your children may have even more in their possession. So there is something which is not the future, but it's the present of our generation. At the same time, it's indeed right to highlight that there are certainly more opportunities if policy can focus on exploiting these opportunities. I would just like to name one, which in the coming months is going to be at the heart of the policy debates. You surely noted that the President of the Commission asked Mario Draghi, the former Prime Minister, former Central Bank Governor, to work on competitiveness. And I think it's very important to ensure that this notion of competitiveness doesn't fall back to the interpretation of this word like it was 10 years ago, when everybody was focusing on cost competitiveness and wages and taxation. They should look into the opportunities which technology offers and how, through technological investment and innovation, the European Union could indeed either catch up with others or even achieve some advantage in a globalized economic competition, especially since we do not only have globalized economic competition, but also globalized economic warfare. And that's something that needs to be taken very, very seriously. But while we are speaking about opportunities, I would very much agree that we also need to look at the risks, especially from the social point of view, because indeed the digital revolution creates a new segment in the economy, apart from transforming basically everything. And it needs to be ensured that this new segment of the economy doesn't break away from what we call the European social model and doesn't break out of the territory where European social law applies. And of course, it's not a unique case when policymakers need to pay attention to this. I would compare this to what was done 10 years ago when it was highlighted that a certain profession, which was then the seafarers, were not falling under the labor legislation of the European Union. So this gap had to be closed. And now the same situation is with the platform work. So it has to be scrutinized where the platform work also is covered properly. And this is not 5 minutes to solve because there are so many specificities of the sector. But this is indeed a necessity to ensure that the overall effect is not downgrading, but upgrading our European social model. I can say that also in the next cycle, FEPS will continue to work on this topic, hand in hand with the MEPs. I'm really grateful that so many academic experts and policymakers from all different European countries are helping us. I would certainly underline the support we received from Francesca Bria, not only on this occasion, but also on previous ones. And we will count on you and other colleagues to develop this policy field for FEPS, but for the entire social democratic family in Brussels.
Thank you, Laszlo and Alex. We have a long program ahead of us with a lot of good speakers. There are many of them are already present in the room. I would like to go to the first panel, and I would like to invite Justin Nogerede, the moderator, onto the stage. To invite, I think you will invite the speakers, I guess, right? Yes.
Yes, good morning. Welcome, everyone, to the first panel of today's full-day conference, where we talk about the world of work, labor, a new social pact for the digital society, the labor perspective. As Alex already said, there's a lot of work to be done, and that holds especially true for the world of work, the digitalization of the workplace. Now, we're running a bit late, both with the panel and with the work that has to be done to protect workers' rights. So let's get to it. I will not make a lot of comments, but I will say that I think it's frankly the case that digital technology is employed as a tool of class domination. We have seen a widening power imbalance between capital and labor with the introduction of digital technologies. Now, we have panelists that are much better than me to explain the different types of exploitation that we see, of course, in the platform economy, surveillance, but also across the workforce. And as Laszlo indeed already mentioned, this is specifically the case in the platform economy, but I think it's really important to point out at the start that it's way beyond that. I think sometimes in Europe we think it's a niche phenomenon. It's like, yes, we have a few platform workers, that trend has limited out, but we can contain that with, for instance, the Platform Work Directive. But I think, and I really want to use this panel to kind of raise the alarm and say that this is really an issue that affects all workers, and that will only increase with the latest developments that we see in, for instance, AI. And that means that with digital technology, the social contract that many took for granted, and the acceptance of a division of labor and some reduced autonomy for workers in exchange for stable employment, social protections, and a voice in workplace decisions has broken down. And we are seeing entire sectors spring up that thrive on low wage and precarious labor, intense algorithmic management, and surveillance, and where workers have few rights. And the supranational platforms that govern these labor markets and decide what data gets collected and what not, what workers' rights actually have and what they don't, is really affecting a lot of workers. Now, this can be difficult to challenge, right? Because digital technology is often seen as inevitable, as the most efficient, synonymous with progress. But technology is not given, it's designed, and it can serve different purposes. It can be used to augment control, cut down labor costs, or it can be used to create meaningful jobs and augment human skill. And that's a choice. That's a choice we can make with policies, with investments, with collective action. And I think we should also really keep in mind that efficiency is not the end goal. Right? There's trade-offs, there's other things. There's like worker dignity, workers' rights, workers' autonomy that we shouldn't crush in the process of pursuing an abstract goal of efficiency that often proves illusory in the end. Now, in this panel, I would really like to discuss concrete policy options for the next elections. But before we do that, I would like to give the floor to Veena Dubal. She joins us remotely. She's a professor of law at the University of California, and she has published prolifically on the gig economy and the platform economy, how workers are being exploited in the platform economy, also beyond. And she's actually in Silicon Valley and joining us at night. I believe it's 12 or 1 at this point in Silicon Valley. So huge thanks. And Veena, please give us the US perspective.
I'm deeply honored to be here. Good morning, distinguished members of the European Parliament. I speak to you from the United States, where it is 1 a.m. in California. Here in the US, the average person spends over 1/3 of their life at work. This amounts to some 90,000 hours of time when their bodily movement and second-by-second activity can be recorded, monitored, and used not only to manage, pay, punish, terminate, or reward, but also to make predictive assessments that can affect them for the rest of their lives. Pre-pandemic, roughly 30% of large US companies use some form of digitalized employee monitoring. And in just the last 3 years, beginning shortly after the global stay-at-home orders, commercial demand for worker surveillance has grown exponentially. Today, in 2023, roughly 60% of larger US employers use technologies to track at least some of their employees. These automated systems record and quantify workers' movement or activities, their personal habits and attributes, and even sensitive biometric information about their stress and health levels. Employers then feed these amassed data sets on workers' lives into machine learning systems to make hiring determinations, to influence worker behavior, to increase their productivity, to intuit workplace problems, including worker organizing, and, as I especially want to highlight today, to determine worker pay. So the dangers posed by workplace surveillance fall most heavily on the most vulnerable workers in the US, mostly racial minority and immigrant workers. They exacerbate an array of economic inequalities and prevent these workers from challenging increasingly invasive practices. But worker monitoring is also part of a cycle of restructured work arrangements through which firms de-skill workers and misclassify their employees, allowing them to pay workers less. Indeed, many of these technologies of surveillance, now used across the labor market, were first introduced in on-demand logistics sectors, where workers are misclassified as independent contractors or self-employed people. While many regulators looked the other way, app-deployed workers like Uber drivers or Amazon delivery workers served in experimental zones where employers experimented with surveillance. In these under-regulated labor contexts, firms used insights from behavioral science together with machine learning technologies to control workers in ways that negatively impacted their wages, hurt their bodies, violated any decent notion of privacy, undermined their ability to collectively organize, and over the course of their lifetimes, decreased possibilities of economic mobility. But to date, policy concerns and solutions about growing technological surveillance in the workplace have largely mirrored the apprehensions articulated by consumer advocates. So many policymakers in the US have limited their concerns to the growing limitations on worker privacy and autonomy and a general lack of transparency around workplace rules. And though these concerns are valid, they do not fully capture the extent of the harms that people are experiencing, nor do they stop the dystopian worlds of work that are being built. As a result, proposed policy regulations have not addressed the core problems that arise under these digitalized surveillance systems. Let me give you just one example. So about a year ago, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy released a non-legally binding handbook identifying 5 principles that should guide the design, use, and deployment of automated systems to protect the American public in the age of artificial intelligence. So these principles called for automated systems that first were safe and effective, second, protected individuals from discrimination, third, offered users control over how their data was used. Fourth, provided notice and explanation that an automated system was actually being used. And fifth, allowed users access to a person who could remedy any kind of problem that they encountered with the automated system. The blueprint for AI rights specified that these enumerated rights extended to employment-related systems, so not just to consumer systems, but also to the workplace, and that workplace algorithms that inform all aspects of the terms and conditions of employment also finally needed to be regulated. And under each of these principles, the blueprint provided an illustrative example of the kinds of harms that the principle was meant to address. So one example, used to specify what defines unsafe and ineffective automation in the workplace, involved an unnamed company that had installed AI-powered cameras in their delivery vans to monitor workers' driving habits, ostensibly for safety reasons. And the blueprint stated that the system, quote, incorrectly penalized drivers when other cars cut them off, and as a result, drivers were incorrectly ineligible to receive a bonus, end quote. So the specific harm that was identified by the blueprint was the mistaken calculation that the AI system made in allocating pay to the worker. But what the blueprint doesn't specify is that the company that they are speaking of, which is Amazon, doesn't directly employ the delivery worker that they are talking about. Rather, the company contracts with delivery service providers, which are small businesses that Amazon helps to establish and that completely depend on Amazon. And in this putative non-employment arrangement, Amazon does not provide to the delivery service provider workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, health insurance, the protected right to organize, nor does it provide to individual delivery service providers or their workers minimum wage or overtime protections. These Amazon created and controlled businesses rely heavily on their automated bonuses to pay for support, repairs, and for driver wages. So as one DSP owner worker complained to an investigator, quote, Amazon uses these AI surveillance cameras allegedly to make sure that they have a safe driving workforce, but they actually use them not to pay us. They just take our money and expect that to motivate us to figure it out. So presented with this additional information, we should ask, what exactly is the harm of this digital surveillance and the automated systems that are being deployed? Is it, as the blueprint specifies, the algorithm's mistake in this instance, which prevented the worker from getting his bonus? Or is it the structure of Amazon's payment system, rooted in the evasion of employment law, digital surveillance, data extraction from labor, and algorithmic control? And I believe, and I want you to believe me in saying that it's actually the latter. Amazon's automated control structure and payment mechanisms represent an emergent and under-theorized firm technique arising from the logic of informational capitalism, the use of what I have called in my research algorithmic wage discrimination to maximize profits and to exert control over worker behavior. Algorithmic wage discrimination refers to a practice in which individual workers are paid differently hourly wages, calculated with ever-changing formulas using granular data on location, individual behavior, demand, supply, and any number of other factors for broadly similar work. So as a wage pricing technique, algorithmic wage discrimination encompasses not only digitalized payment for completed work, but critically digitalized decisions to allocate work, which are significant determinants of hourly wages and levers of firm control. So as a labor management practice, algorithmic wage discrimination has created a dystopic yet widely accepted system of wage allocation. It allows firms to personalize and differentiate wages for workers in ways that are unknown to the workers themselves, paying them to behave in ways that the firm desires, and perhaps for as little as the system determines that the workers may be willing to accept. And given the information asymmetry between workers and firms, companies can calculate the exact wage rates necessary to incentivize desired behaviors, while workers can only guess as to how firms determine their wages. And in my own research, I found that workers experience this wage allocation system in the absence of state regulation as a form of deception and manipulation. And through this practice, like other forms of algorithmic management, began in the on-demand workplace, it is now seeping into other employment sectors, including computer science and healthcare sectors. And what has enabled it and its cultural acceptance and normalization is the failure of state actors in the US to properly regulate these experimental zones of workplace surveillance. So in the US, almost no law addresses or regulates these activities, and efforts to even enforce existing laws like the minimum wage and overtime to at least stabilize the detrimental effects have largely failed, due to the structural and instrumental power of the firms that employ these workers. So I'm here to start this panel to offer a cautionary note, a red light, if you will. In Europe, with regard to the Platform Work Directive and other laws being considered, I ask that you think of the forms of surveillance and the impacts of these surveillance that I've described as practices that have to be reined in, regulated, and in some instances, even banned, abolished. Not just for the purposes of undermining the possibility of mistakes, of technological mistakes, or for facilitating privacy or transparency, but more broadly, to cut off the kinds of harms that they inflict on people, on their psyche, on their ability to lead stable lives, on their ability to have economic certainty, and even to expand their life possibilities. The U.S. at this point is very much a cautionary note and not an example to follow. I'm hopeful about the kinds of regulations and laws that I see being debated in the European context. But again, I really want to underscore that the kinds of compromises that I see with regard to, for example, the Platform Work Directive, that the impacts will spread far, far, far beyond the on-demand economy, as we are already seeing in the U.S., to impact the kinds of sectors that we think of as being not innovative and not new, but as actually being central to care, as being central to our infrastructures, as being central to our logistics economy, and to negatively harm the workers that make our worlds possible. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vena. I really appreciated how you also make concrete what the harms are of surveillance. Because for instance, I'm Dutch, and in the Netherlands, those arguments about surveillance often fall flat. It's like, yeah, I have nothing to hide. I mean, what is the harm? And you point out very concretely what the harms are. This is about your chances for promotion. This is about worker pay. This is about psychological harms perpetrated on workers. So you made that very concrete. Thanks a lot. I know, again, that it's now well past midnight in the US. So I thank you again very much, Vena, and we'll get back to you later with the outcomes of the panel. But for now, we thank you. And we go on with the panel discussion. So I would like to introduce the panelists. We have a stellar panel. Let me introduce them one by one, and then you can come on the stage. First, we have with us Ana Rosa Pesole, Head of Digitalization at the Partito Democratico in Italy. Also a prolific researcher, has worked for the Commission, for instance, on platform work already, like really when it's just started, like almost a decade ago. So let's give her an applause. We have with us Fredrik Söderqvist. He came over from Sweden. He's an economist. He works for the LO Sweden, that's the trade union federation in Sweden. He focuses on automation, digitalization, collective bargaining over technology. So a great expert, and he's also here to represent, I guess, the famous Nordic model when it comes to collective bargaining. So welcome, Fredrik. Thank you. Third, we have, of course, Agnes Jongerius, long-term member of the European Parliament, almost 10 years by now, I think. Long-seating member of the Ample Committee here in the Parliament. Also, trade union was in the Netherlands for a long time, I think almost a decade. So we have with us a great voice also for the workers and collective bargaining. Welcome, Agnes. Thank you. Fourth, we have Daniel Mugge from Amsterdam. He's a professor in the political arithmetic at the University of Amsterdam, leading a big research project on the effects of algorithms globally, but also in society and politics. Welcome, Daniel. And last but not least, Oliver Reutig. He is the regional secretary of Uni Europa, that is the trade union federation for services. He represents millions of service workers across Europe. And of course, services are perhaps one of the most affected sectors when we talk about digital technology. So an extremely relevant perspective. Oliver, welcome. And perhaps, Oliver, this is not fair because you come on last, but maybe we start with you actually, because we just listened to Vena Dubal. She kind of gave the US perspective. She gave the US perspective. I think a lot of people then think, yeah, this is the US, and as Vena already said, the US is perhaps not the example when you talk about regulated labor markets, etc. So perhaps you can puncture some myths about the fact that this is just limited to the US. What's happening in Europe? What's happening in the services sector? Should we be concerned? And perhaps, sorry, Oliver, before you start, we have really little time, so I will cut you off. I know it's a bad Dutch stereotype. I don't want to be rude, but we stick to 5 minutes for each of the introductions.
So you just interrupt me whenever you want.
Will do.
Well, it's the same here in Europe. I think in Europe we have the advantage that we have something like a European social model, but a European social model that has been built up over 100 years and not necessarily is fit for purpose. I think Laszlo was saying, you know, with new technologies, with new forms of work coming in, there are holes in our legislation. And I think that needs to be filled. We tried this with a platform directive, but I mean, there's also a point. Many things which happen to platform workers happen to other workers as well. Where is the difference between platform workers online and platform workers in a contact and in a call center? Where is the difference there? And so what do you want to do? Depending on in what form you work in the same company, you have different workers' rights. So there's some issues which go beyond, and really we need some broad rules for everyone. We're talking about platform work, algorithmic management. But I mean, all this is not really new. I mean, when I look at platform work, I mean, precarious working relationships where you don't have a contract, where you basically work from week to week, that was a standard when we look 150 years back, before industrialization happened, before trade unions came about. And the other day I was watching Modern Times with Charlie Chaplin again, with the assembly line. When you look at algorithmic management, that's not much different. So I think we have to be careful and also making sure that we don't fall for what all those great entrepreneurs of the future who bring us great things say, that everything is new and so they need to have a different rule. I think the key point is workers are workers and they should all have in principle the same rules. Certainly legislative rules, and then we can have collective bargaining to fine-tune it for the industry. One key point for this is we have already the strategies to deal with this. New technologies has been around. So what we as trade unions see as important, we need to be involved in the implementation, from the start of an implementation to really going to the end. And Amazon is not doing this. I mean, that's an American model. They don't ask, they don't involve the workers, and then normally when it's implemented, then there is a mess, and then somehow it has to be sorted out. Here in Europe, we have actually the better model to do this. And one key point, what I think we have also a strength here in Europe, is we have a good health and safety system at the European level, at the national level. So how can we make sure that this is actually upheld? And that is a joint effort by the employers, by the trade unions, workers, and of course, our public authority. And then we're talking about strategic autonomy. Our capital are the workers in Europe. It's not the money, like in the US, or state control and pushing everybody in the same direction. So we need skills and training. So what we're doing here at the European level is important. And we have our collective bargaining system, which is better than everywhere else. So we have the basis here. But now when I look at Amazon, and there I look in particular at algorithmic management, some years ago we published a report, the Panopticon and Amazon. And there the point is they check everyone. You're in a situation where every move you're making is told by a machine to you and it's supervised. And it is in Amazon where this monitoring is happening, there it's the starkest, but it's filtering in other parts of the industry as well. Platforms, you see this. And so what do we do about it? And there is not only an issue, when I go back to the idea of Panopticon, it was basically in prisons where there was somebody looking at you and you didn't know whether he was looking at you. So it was basically self-censorship. And algorithmic management is basically this. It pushes you in a position where you don't know whether you're controlled. The big difference nowadays is you're actually controlled. With algorithmic management, there is someone who can basically evaluate every step of you. One key point of it, that creates stress. People being afraid, and actually we see this in Amazon, the health and safety rate where it's going wrong is quite high. So the issue there is it's bad for the workers because they fall out of work at some stage. So you know, in Germany we have a saying, working 150%, and that's an Amazon strategy, bringing people to work 150% and discarding them if they can't do it anymore. We see that. I mean, there are examples on the UK, for instance, the incidents when ambulances had to go to an Amazon operation. But there is another issue as well with this stress. It's bad for society. So because if you discard the people, there's a social security system, whether it's a health insurance, the pension system, or just the inability to work system that falls on it. So there's really a point where we have to act together. And then when we look at algorithmic management, there's an issue of location. Issues are made from the US, and do we want to give our data to the US on the one hand, but also it's a question of money. And that's a problem within the European Union and to the other parts. I mean, what is happening here? You know, money is produced in Germany or elsewhere. It ends up in Ireland and then in somehow, in some ways or so, then in the pocket of Bezos. So we really have to stop there.
Thank you very much, Oliver. What I hear is that this is actually not really a new problem, it's an old problem. It's about the introduction of new technology, which of course has been happening for now, well, a very long time, and how to increase workers' voice in that, collective bargaining. At the same time, we also know this is quite difficult to do in the services sector, for instance. So perhaps it's interesting to now make the bridge to Sweden, where, as I understand it, Frederick, you have some examples of very successful collective bargaining. Of course, it's the mining sector. It's strongly organized. They have a lot of leverage. But how do you look at this idea of really being involved from the workers' perspective in the introduction of new technology, and how can this be done successfully? And perhaps more difficult, can the success in Sweden, in, for instance, the mining sector, be transplanted to the services sector, where there's a lot of issues?
Yeah, so thank you for having me here. I should say that this is based on a case study that I'm doing for my PhD dissertation, where myself and my co-author, tried to address the lack of successive cases of workers actually having an influence over algorithmic management and algorithmic systems. So we were actually looking for a case that was similar in a lot of perspectives. It was similar in the sense that it was similar technologies, and a lot of those technologies that have been discussed here already is positioning systems. Another thing that's similar in the mining industry that you might not think about compared to the service sector is that, you know, mining operations is to a very high degree logistics. It's moving materials from point A to B. So once you've blasted and loaded everything onto a truck, you need to drive it up to the surface for further processing. The case is dissimilar, of course, in other ways. It's very Swedish. There's very strong union, even for Sweden. And there is a very constructive union management relationship. And I should also mention that at this particular company, the staff, the workers, the miners themselves are highly involved in actually developing the technologies of this mining automation program that we study. So just some brief background. Mining automation is essentially making some of the largely the transportation operations autonomous. So having autonomous vehicles run underground. And in order to do that, you need to have first very high bandwidth wireless telecommunication technologies, and you need to have positioning systems in place. And I will talk a little bit about how the local unions here, IF Metall above all, were able to have a really constructive dialogue around how they handled the positioning of workers here. So why would you want to position workers in a mine? So a really big advantage that's positive for the union in this case is that knowing where everyone is at every time in a mine is a huge improvement in worker safety. So in the past, I think all over Europe, if you're in a mine, the employer has to know all the time exactly who is underground, and you have to have their social security insurance number and everything, so you know when something goes wrong, who is underground or not. Having a wireless telecommunication system or having positioning of the workers where they are means that if something happens underground, you can see who made it to the rescue chamber, who made it to safety, and who didn't. So the fire brigade that does the rescue operation estimated that they save about an hour and a half on every rescue operation by having this system in place. However, the concern here is, of course, very similar to, for example, warehouses, is that, well, are you going to be monitoring our bathroom breaks? Because you know where we are all the time in the mine. So in order to do this, the employer engaged the unions really early on in an open discussion about having these systems. How can we get these good parts out of the system, which means that we can improve safety, but eliminating the bad aspects, which have to do with integrity or wage setting, for example, doing micromanagement and checking, are you exactly at this point in that time? The employer actually wasn't that interested in knowing exactly where everyone is at all times, because some of the mines that we study in this case study have the highest productivity in the world in their respective categories of mine and mining technique that they use. So it means that they produce more ore per man hour. And one reason they do this is that the company trusts that their miners are really skilled, that they do their job. And by trusting them in this, they actually become more productive. So the equity efficiency trade-off is kind of off in this case. Formally, they do this. There's two parts to this. An employer who wants to implement a change in the workplace in Sweden has to follow the Co-Determination in the Workplace Act. The first part is informing in good time. The second part is formally negotiating. And in this case, the employer puts a lot of weight on the information part. And that means that you have a very informal dialogue about the purpose of the technology, how it's going to be implemented, and working out the risks and getting both parties interested in a more informal setting until you finally sit down and punch out the rules in a local collective bargaining agreement. They solve this integrity concern by anonymizing. So you can see where there are people all the time in the mine on the monitors, but you can't see the name. And that means that algorithmic management is essentially taken out of the equation. And they paid a vendor to develop this anonymization feature, and everyone seems to be happy about that. Now, why would they agree to this? This is like the big why Sweden's weird. But the issue here is trust. You should trust that the workers are productive, and unions trust that management will actually develop systems that aren't doing bad things to their workers. But that doesn't really satisfy me as a researcher. Like, why is this trust so valuable? So we started asking the unions and the employers about what would happen if trust were to drastically erode from your counterparty's perspective. The unions were kind of reluctant to answer that, but then when we told them what the employer said, they started telling us what actually the power levers that are inherent to the Swedish local co-determination model. The employers immediately, all of them said, we wouldn't be getting any night shifts. Because in the Swedish setting, you have a Working Place Act that is replaced in its entirety by a sectoral collective bargaining agreement. And that sectoral collective bargaining agreement is kind of bad from the employer's perspective. It doesn't allow night shifts. So they have to proactively buy night shifts from the unions in this mine in order to do night shifts. And why am I bringing this up in the European Parliament? Swedish unions are very keen to keep these power resources at the local level, and the European Union in labor dimensions have, over the past few years, have a tendency to want to detail regulate some aspects. And I think this is really important when we talk about algorithmic management, because it's a local issue. It's always, always, always a local issue. You can have the identical system, but in the socio-technical dimension of the local workplace, how it is implemented is the key. So making sure that the unions locally have some bargaining chip in order to gain influence here, that is a first step to make a productive union management relationship. Because if not, the employer can always say, we're following the law. But if they're not, there's no cost to getting along with the local union. And that means, the local union has to have something that they can actually, enforce. So yeah, I will end up there. It's a long study. I hope you can all read it soon when it's done in the next few weeks. Thanks.
Looking forward to that. Thanks, Frederick. I heard a few things. So, what's the success of collective bargaining over technology in the mining sector? This is about very high-skilled workers, high trust, which perhaps to some degree is specific to Sweden, because I think that in the services sector, for instance, there's also a high turnover, a lot of migrant labor, so it's just a very different context. You also mentioned, what I found interesting, is the development of specific technology. So they paid a vendor to develop something that actually reflects the outcomes and the values that you have in the specific workplace. And I think that's perhaps something to dive deeper into later, because I don't think we do that often enough when you talk about services. But let's take a little bit of a different approach, a different perspective. Let's go to Anna Rosa. You have looked a lot at workers' collective rights over data, and how we can perhaps strengthen that, which I think is crucial, especially also for the services sector. Perhaps you can share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the previous panelists, because it was very interesting and they set the scene very easily for me. Indeed, I'm not going to go back to the risk of digital workers, although I want to make a point that I talk about digital workers and not platform workers for the thing that you said before. We are not talking any longer to people who just work on the platform realm. We are talking about workers who are under algorithm management, who are under basically the control and managing of digital technologies. So I need to do a very, very quick step back in order to talk about collective rights, because many things have been said about digital workers, about how they are more at risk of work intensification, higher surveillance, limited autonomy. Another thing that is important to point out is that this type of workers, even if they are sharing the same physical space, are actually are more isolated and more dispersed. And this is basically something that reflects in the possibility for them to self-organize or for the trade unions to organize them. In addition to this, we have to take into account the platform. They retain all the knowledge that actually they gather from data accumulation. And this is, as well, is another factor that exacerbates the power asymmetry that you have into the labor market, and particularly up to the point that actually trade unions or governmental institutions are completely excluded by any form of negotiation or even simple verification of compliance or labor standards and labor law. So, and not only that, another point is that platform, as a private data infrastructure, they are trying, someone could say even successfully, to put them forward as alternative private regulatory bodies. Basically, they are trying to present themselves as alternative potential bodies that could regulate some of the function of the state, and they want to do that by somehow endowing themselves with a sort of self-regulation power that is based on code of conduct of terms and conditions. So this is the scenario that we are actually presenting, that we're facing today. What shall we do in order to reestablish a power symmetry in this scenario? That's the real question. Well, first of all, is that we have somehow to redistribute the power balance. You know, we have to redistribute power to the different social actors. In order to do that, we need a new social contract. And this new social contract has to be centered in social welfare, pursuing the public interest, and how could we actually do it? Well, I think that from both last night and what we heard this morning, it comes very clear that, you know, we reach finally the point where we all agree on the fact that technology companies cannot be the sole holder of data information. Governments, trade unions, they must have access to the same data that actually employers use in order to train and feed the algorithms that eventually will decide and define the working condition for workers. However, I want to make a point when we're talking about transparency, because this is a risky business. When we're talking about transparency, we must decline this concept into the framework of social participation and co-determination in the workplace. Why do I say so? Let me try to be more explicit with a practical example. Let's take, for example, the algorithm management section, the regulation in the platform directive. What we have so far in the proposal from the Commission is basically, I would call it more than transparency, is mere visibility. Because what they are asked to provide is information about the parameters and information about the process. However, there is not any mechanism taken into account in order actually for either trade unions nor workers to really start a social dialogue about this. I mean, the experience of the miners in Sweden teaches us something, that actually that should be the way to go. So why it is important that actually we kind of like contrast this idea of transparency as mere visibility. When we're taking this approach, if we actually keep thinking transparency in this way, is the equivalent of saying with no room, you know, for social dialogue or participation, is the equivalent of saying that we are accepting a techno-deterministic approach. What we're saying is that we cannot regulate technology, we can just regulate the effects of technology. This is something that personally I think it's against, you know, the fair development of working conditions in the workplace. Just, you know, talking about the realm of workers. On the contrary, what I believe is that we should use all the tools, we should strengthen all the tools that we have at our disposal in order to ensure that the process of technological development is guided and shaped by the pursuit of social welfare and is not actually driven by market-defined interest. That, for me, is a crucial point. What are the tools that I'm talking about when I say, you know, the tools that we have at our disposition? Well, these tools actually are tools that comes from setting standards, labor standards, or promoting the use of technology that are based on interoperability principle, open source principle, but most importantly, we need to invest and create digital common spaces. And we need to give workers actually rights on the data they produce in the workplace. This is important. And in other terms, I mean, if you want, this could go under the realm of saying that we need to establish collective rights for workers, where basically both workers and trade unions must be allowed to influence the use of technology, the use of which data are legitimate, you know, in the workplace, for which purposes, under what circumstances. Yeah, I'll close with this one. And then, so they can have actually control on this one. Just let me say, just very quickly, a very quick remark. This is something that, for example, if you look at European Data Governance Act, is providing already a potential alternative how public DigiSpace could be used and how this collective could be created. And for example, these collective workers might take the form of data trusts. So just a quick remark, then perhaps, you know, with a question we can even go a little bit more into details, is that I really believe that the way in order to ensure that there is a fair digital transition for workers is first creating like, you know, giving access to workers and creating safe space for workers' data sharing. And the second one, however, this won't be enough if we do not create the public digital infrastructure, and then I can talk perhaps later about the Italian experience about this, you know, we are just half of the way. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anna Rosa. I don't know how much time we have for a big discussion on Italy specifically, given the time that we have, but it was super interesting. And what I really take home from this is that, like, we shouldn't just look at let's say we shouldn't just try to regulate existing technology by just asking for like individual information for workers. You know, we have also tried this with the General Data Protection Regulation, for instance, which doesn't really work at the workplace. And instead we should try to influence directly like the affordances of the technology itself, right? And I think the Platform Work Directive tries that in some ways. For instance, I think there's an article saying workers should have direct communication channels to which unions also have access so they can communicate privately without the employer knowing. That's, for instance, one example. Because I think just focusing on like rights without doing anything with the infrastructure makes it very difficult to enforce. And I think that's a huge problem for European legislation in general, but specifically for regulations at the workplace. And that also brings me naturally to you, Agnes, because of course you have overseen quite a bit of regulations in the workplace, and the Commission and the Parliament have been very active on that in the past term, the past 5 years. For instance, the Platform Work Directive, you've been closely involved, but also the Minimum Wage Directive, which also has stipulations about collective bargaining. So perhaps, given what you just heard, how do you think, what kind of actions should we take? Also considering the difficulties of enforcement that we have with legislation, what are the next steps that we should take to improve workers' data rights, workers' rights in the digital workspace the coming term?
It's a very difficult question because I think
I know.
It's not for nothing that the negotiations on the AI Act are going on for more than 12 hours now. And they have not finished yet. And I would like to make the statement that we're going to close the negotiations on the Platform Directive with a progressive outcome next week. But I must say I'm fearing a situation where we come to a deadlock. And then, of course, we have 2 months of Belgium's coming up in the seat of the presidency. Perhaps that could make a difference. But otherwise, you could say, on the one hand, glass half full. We made it with the Minimum Wage Directive. We made it with, indeed, a quite good call of saying workers in Europe should be covered, at least for 80%, by collective agreements, therefore pushing the work of the trade unions, having for the first time also at the European level trade union rights enshrined in a directive. But if I look at the platform, it was already in her opening speech that Ursula von der Leyen, so in 2019, that Ursula von der Leyen said, I want to regulate the Platform Directive. I don't allow these substandard working conditions in Europe. And now, nearly 4 years later, I cannot give a guarantee that we can make it. And if we are not going to make it, not only I don't like losing, but I don't like losing from Uber or Amazon or those companies. And I think if we are losing out for the next 4 or 5 years. So everyone who can send good vibes into the direction of these negotiations, more than welcome. And coming from a Roman Catholic background, my mother would say, I will burn a candle for you, but I'm not sure yet. And if not, then this should be at our top priority list for the next elections. I went to Berlin this Monday because, let's say, we need the help of the German government influencing the position of council. And the first thing when you step out of your airplane, is this big advertising of Uber saying, do you want to see the Brandenburger Tor? Use Uber. And Uber, by the way, is not a company, but a platform. So they're using quite a lot of pressure and money to influence the debate here in Europe. And so we have to be strong. If we are succeeding, on the one hand, by making now, for the first time, sectoral agreements, regulations around AI at the workplace. But one of the debates is it only platforms or should it also be, let's say, crowd work? But let's see if we can deal with it in the right way. If we are successful, we also going to conclude the possibility of trade unions to organize at the workplace. And if we are successful, then I think the next 2 things we have to do is indeed push for regulation of AI, not only on platforms or on crowd work, but further on in the workplace. So that would be then my top priority next to, let's say, can we please put our money where the law is? So if we think that 80% of the workers should be covered by collective agreements, shall we then make it a golden rule that public money is only spent on real and fair jobs? And also there, I think you will have a lot of lobbying. Also, for instance, from the Amazon. After the report Oliver mentioned, we organized in the Ample Committee a hearing where, of course, we asked the CEO to come, which he didn't do, but also to have workers testify about their situation. And then we thought, as a follow-up, we want to go and pay a visit to Amazon in Europe. What's the situation in Europe? And we had this idea of going to visit 2 Amazon warehouses close to the German-Polish borders, one on the Polish side, one on the German side. This visit should take place not next week, but the week after. Agreed with the management, and then they made a phone call and said, sorry, but it's just before Christmas, and Christmas is always very busy with Amazon. So you are uninvited. And they don't put it on paper because they don't want to make the noise, but I think we really need to make the noise around this because with the platforms, with these big US investors, we also have trade union busting practices in Europe. I mentioned Amazon. I also mentioned what's happening in Sweden, and luckily now with solidarity actions from Denmark in the situation of Tesla. We need to be aware. Let's hope that we can finish the directive. Let's hope that we then can push for more AI at the workplace and public procurement for decent jobs. But we have to be very vigilant. There is trade union busting at the European continent, and we need to fight it.
Thanks a lot, Agnes. I take away 2 points. First, perhaps 3. First, the Platform Work Directive, and that we should light a candle for that. I mean, you come from the Catholic part of the Netherlands, I come from the Protestant part. We don't do candle lighting, we just expect the worst and suffer and hope that the... So that was not the positive message you were perhaps hoping for.
Sorry.
It's okay. On the other 2 points, I mean, on the Platform Work, beyond the Platform Work Directive, I think it's an obvious point indeed that those rights for algorithmic management should be expanded to the entire workforce. So that's perhaps something we can discuss, and we'll get some reactions after. But I also find a really extremely valid point, and perhaps really powerful also, is the fact that we should look at public procurement. You know, why not spend public money in a way that's actually in line with the laws that we already have? That is, I think, 14% of EU GDP. That's hundreds of billions. That can directly influence the market. And I think that's perhaps also something to discuss, and I think Oliver perhaps has something to say about that. But first, I would like to give the floor to Daniel, because what also came up in in various interventions is like the broader perspective, the psychological perspective also, what it does when work gets digitalized, what it does to people's experiences about work, what kind of mental effects it has, and I think you have somehow a broader perspective on that as well, so we'd like to hear that. Daniel, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Justin. Even though I'm German, Catholic candlelighting part, I live in the Netherlands, and news report from there, it really feels like progressive politics in Europe is staring down the barrel of a gun. What happened 2 weeks ago, and I think this does relate actually to what we're talking about here, is that one of the founding members of the European communities elected Geert Wilders as the most popular politician in that country, somebody who has in his party program that he wants to take the Netherlands out of the European Union. That's where we stand, right? This is one of the founding members of the European communities. Now, what does it have to do with talking about AI and labor? What I want to talk about is, I thought about what to call it, and I called it alienation, which is an ugly word and doesn't pronounce very well, but alienation, and the democratic price tag that brings with us. I think we already heard a lot of things about how the deployment of AI in the workplace is actually meant to decrease people's autonomy in the name of increasing their efficiency or the profitability for the employers there. And that's, as we've also heard, not only a case, for example, in ride-hailing, but I think it's the case everywhere, right? People who work with Microsoft Office software, as I think many of you do here, like you're experiencing the strictures, you're experiencing how Microsoft Teams invades your evenings and weekends and these sorts of things, and the pervasive stress that people experience and the dissatisfaction, frustration at our workplace, not just at the workplace of people who clean this room at 3 in the morning, but at our workplaces, I think is a pretty universal experience. Right, that's true in hospitals, it's true in fast food restaurants, it's true also in the lives of university professors whose lives and teaching activities are increasingly structured by digitization software through which we have to interact with our students in a way that I can tell you is really extremely frustrating and dispiriting. Now, if we look at what happened in the elections in the Netherlands, we saw that there was a clear pattern in which people who are relatively satisfied with their lives voted in favor of progressive lefty parties, and people who voted for right-wing parties across the board reported higher levels of dissatisfaction with their lives. Now, my claim is that digitization of workplaces and increasing deployment of AI in workplaces at the margin increases people's dissatisfaction. As Vina was saying earlier, people spend a lot of their waking lives working at the workplace. Right? And I think it's a key plank of a progressive project that we make sure that the time that we spend in our workplaces is time that feels like part of human flourishing and human fulfillment. That's part of progressive politics, having ordinary people flourish. The way that we see AI being implemented right now, I think at the margin leads in the opposite direction. It takes away the fulfillment that people take out of their working experiences. It increases frustration. It makes people more unhappy, period. And that unhappiness feeds into a general sense of discontent that I think wherever you come from in Europe, you're familiar, you experience, and that in turn, I think, feeds a kind of populist politics that is the precise opposite of what progressives should really stand for. Now, what that means is that precisely at a moment when in the 21st century we face challenges that need us coming together, that need us being able to look beyond our own individual horizons, that need us being able to develop collective solutions in the interest of our generation, but also the next generations, in the interest of people elsewhere on this planet, we see human spirits, as it were, somehow shrinking together, fed by these forms of frustration, anomie, alienation, as I call it right here, which is the exact opposite of what we want. Now, the point then is that when we talk about what does the diffusion of artificial intelligence into working lives mean, it's not just about what happens to our pay, it's not just about losing jobs, it's not just about being surveyed in a way that's discriminatory, but it's also potentially putting the brakes onto the potential of human flourishing, of living enjoyable, fulfilled lives. Right? And I think it should be part of a social democratic and a progressive project to say, we want to reclaim that space. We need to use the political tools that are at our disposal to make sure that members of our societies can flourish. And so far, what that means is that I think the debate that we're having is way too narrow. We need to use these tools because if we just let things run freely, I think they move in the opposite direction. Right? So what does that mean in concrete terms? It means developing a language about talking about our experiences that we have in the workplace, which I think many across the board experience often as negatively. Alienation, right? It doesn't pronounce very well, but I think that's part of what's going on. We also need to change other narratives, right? We shouldn't think of AI primarily as a form of product, but we should think of it as a plank of societal transformation. And it's up to us, the citizens and US politicians, to give shape to how that becomes part of how we educate ourselves, how we inform ourselves, how we socialize, how we care for each other. That's part of our political mission here, giving that shape, not just fighting a rearguard action somewhere, right? And finally, as in, I know, Justin, that we have little time, a lot of conversation about digital technologies these days, it's a term that we have heard a number of times already, is dominated by this competitiveness narrative. Right? That is the end-all, be-all. Everybody says, yeah, it would be nice if digital technologies made our lives better, but yeah, there's this competitiveness thing. I really don't believe that the future of European societies hangs on a percentage point GDP more or less. That is not what's going to save the European project, and that's not what's going to save the European peoples. What is going to save the European peoples is making sure through political guardrails that people actually feel happy in their societies, that they feel connected, that they feel that they're thriving, these sorts of things. So a percentage point less of GDP, putting competitiveness to the side for a moment, and then making sure that we put digital technologies in our societies the way that we want them, I think is a key mission for progressive politics. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. And I think this is a crucial point that's often overlooked, I think, also on the progressive side, that if you don't have democracy at the workplace, if that's tightly controlled, then how can you expect democracy in wider society? You learn that on the job. So I think there's a direct link between changes in the workplace and anti-democratic tendencies across Europe as well. That's not a coincidence. So I think that's a crucial point. We have little time. What I suggest that we do is the following. I would like all the panelists to react to the different interventions. And specifically, I would like Oliver and Frederick to react also to Agnes' proposals for future policy. And so that is like algorithm management protections for the entire workplace. This is about potentially losing public procurement rules to kind of boost workers' rights. And of course, any other interventions or something that you want to add to that. And I would like Ana Rosa to also specify a little bit, like how can we create those data spaces, those data trusts for workers? Because I mean, I think this is something that a lot of people agree with. Yes, of course, workers should have control over their data. We should build new institutions to do that. We have the Digital Governance Act, which in theory says that this is possible, that we can create data intermediaries, but it's not happening yet. And I think it could already because the law is in force. How should we take this to the next step? So those are the questions. Let's start with Oliver, then Frederick, and then Ana Rosa. And then Agnes, I know you also have to leave very soon. So I would like you then to conclude. And we take also one question before you do so. So let's go. Oliver, please.
Okay, so as I said, algorithmic management or digitalization as such, what we want is a full involvement of the workers in the design and implementation from the start to the end of a policy and full transparency. And I think the best way to do this is through collective bargaining. That is workers' democracy in the first place. It's collective bargaining where trade unions come together. And I want to add to this, it's actually also the best way to reduce red tape because you can fine-tune the rules to an industry and a particular workspace. And we, of course, have the 80% target of the European Union for collective bargaining coverage, but we are far away from this. So let's look at what we can do. First, what we need, and it's something like an AI Act, so for everyone, is having a proper legislative framework that sets basic rights for the individual workers, but as a starting point, not as an end point. We make a mistake in Europe that we have too many individual rights for workers and too many collective rights for workers which empower the workers collectively in a democratic action to actually shape their own life together with employers. And when I look at some of those individual rights, I think we need a law which says there should be no individualization of monitoring data that the employers get. And I think the other one, and there I come back to democracy at work, we should make sure that those data which they collect of workers are actually not leaving the space in which there is proper workers' representation. And that means in Europe, the European Works Council in the end is an information consultation body, so not to the European level, it has to be at the national level where you actually have workers' involvement, where you have some power to do something about it. And second, and that is really what Agnes was saying, we need a political and legislative framework that empowers trade unions to negotiate. We don't have this at the moment. We have a constant reduction in the coverage of collective bargaining, and there comes the EU in because the single market is one of the key problem makers in this. Look at Amazon. I mean, in Germany, they're striking for 10 years, and they still don't have a collective bargaining. So what can we do with this? And another issue is with collective bargaining. When we talk about new technology comes about because productivity increases. And when I look at Amazon, their idea is the cake gets bigger. The worker should get less part of the cake, both in proportionate and absolute terms, and that has repercussions for the workers, but for everyone else in society as well. So to help this, I think digital access, Agnes was mentioning this as well. I mean, how can we empower trade unions actually to get in there? And when we look at algorithmic management, digitalization, it's digital access. It's an issue of public procurement. I mean, there is absolutely no reason why the European Commission refuses to use their biggest leverage to do something about it. Public procurement is a leverage to force employers to do collective agreements and entice them, actually. And we are convinced in Europe, and there are studies out there right and left, that if you have especially sectoral collective bargaining is better for society at large. It's a public good, and we should go out and say that collective bargaining is a public good and not something nobody wants to talk about and which is bad for us. And then one issue, what I also think is important, we have Amazon coming over here, but we also have US labor lawyers coming over here who have the feeling that it's a new marketplace for the business of trade union busting. We need to do something there as well. Last point is we have Amazon coming over. I'm still believing in the European social model, and we all do it. And when you come to Rome, do like the Romans do. And what they are doing is like the Vandals trying to destroy Rome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. That's a big agenda. And I think that's, of course, the crucial point also the past decades. Like, how can we strengthen collective bargaining? How can we strengthen unionization rates? Because that is, of course, the most effective way to make sure that digital transformation is in the interests and benefits workers. Let's move to Frederick for additional comments on this and also a reaction to Agnes.
Yeah, so Oliver stole a lot of my points here.
Which is good, because that means we can
which
keep
is
it
fine,
short.
which means I can focus on some other things. I think it's important when we look at what kind of regulation from the EU level, how do we balance the issue of individual versus collective rights, which was something you were in on. There is a risk that individual rights crowd out collective rights. And if the progressive European Union movements have an ambition to strengthen unions, that's an important parameter to take in, because having too many individual rights risk placing less delegation on unions and employers to solve things on their own. And that gets into a little bit about the issue about competitiveness, which I think is super important in this aspect. If you can have a constructive union management dialogue throughout Europe, you will get technological implementation in work organizations that will be probably more productive and more profitable than what you do with the current top-down approaches of simply management ordering everything. I'm absolutely convinced of that because people are smart, and if people can adapt the systems according to the local conditions, there will be innovations that come out of that which are phenomenal, that are currently not being taken. Another thing I want to comment on really briefly is, I mean, I think that GDPR is actually a good example of a framework that provides local units with something to talk about. I mean, on our case study, they use GDPR a lot. Although there's no way you can derogate from it, the size of the sanction means that the employer is really keen to listen about this. And the idea that you have a format to discuss issues about integrity and data around the points that what data is being collected, what is it going to be used for, and when it's going to be deleted. Those 3 points are simple and really good for any kind of discussion about these things. So that's our experience from this firm. They take GDPR very seriously, and maybe they do it because it would be costly not to do it. But on that, I mean, generally, I think my takeaway is that for the next European Parliament and for the next Commission, I would like to see more focus on how we make the union movement grow, both in size and capacity and in responsibility they have in handling these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Point well taken, also on collective rights, which I think is crucial. I do think that in the GDPR, that's not always as effective as it could have been. For instance, collective representation of workers without having to be mandated specifically. But of course, it's an important point, and I think it has been a big step. But as said, let's now move to Ana Rosa to specify a little bit what you mean with data trust and how this could be made concrete in the workplace.
Yeah, and just a quick note about the GDPR. The GDPR, of course, it's one of the tools that could be used, but there is an issue when we're talking about data collected in the workplace. The majority of these data are not necessarily personal data, so GDPR doesn't apply. And then there is also the issue about consent, even if it's been somehow claimed that consent cannot be considered valid in a working situation. Still, I mean, there is a little bit too much focus on what the GDPR could do in the workplace, and I think actually should be shifted because GDPR needs to be adapted. As anything that has been created for being like protection of fundamental rights, we're talking about collective rights. It's not. It has to be, you know, uplifted to a different dimension. This is what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's not a good basis, but it should be uplifted. When we're talking about how concretely can we actually create data collectives, because this is what we're talking about. It's, of course, we do not have the public infrastructure. We don't have it. We won't have it tomorrow. So the first thing is that let's start it from this awareness that the digital infrastructure is not there. So basically means that we have to start public-private partnership in order to assure that we can use, you know, the private infrastructure for public purposes. Because, I mean, like if you wait to our own public infrastructure, we're going to wait for another 20 years if. So this is the first thing that should be taken into account. The second one is that there are different forms. There are data commons, there are data trusts, there are other type of data collectivization strategy that could be used. One thing that is important, I think that in the specific case of work, data trust perhaps fits better for the reason that normally, I mean, the way in which a data trust works is that there is the data subjector and the data collectors that actually agree to put together this data information in a vault that is managed by a third intermediary, which is binded to use this information just for what are the constituency of the data trust, for what it is not agreed by or what permitted by law, but what is agreed by the people who are actually giving the data to them, the passage of the data. So this could be like, let me give you a very quick example of what we try to do in Italy, just because I was mentioning it before. What we did in Italy is that we approved, when I was working in the cabinet of the Ministry of Labor with the previous government, and what we did is that we actually approved a legislation that enforce mandatory information about algorithm decision in the workplace. This data, the idea of this data is that after exploiting a little bit the digitalization of the Social Security Institute and the OSH Institute in Italy, we wanted to build in that framework, we wanted to build like an experimental vault for this type of data. We didn't manage in the end because, the government fell and, as you know, the situation had politically drastically changed in Italy. But this is, I think, is a strategy that it's practical and could be implemented It's not something, we're not talking about something absurd. It's a matter of investment, and it is an investment that has also to be accompanied by investment in digital knowledge. I don't want to call it digital skills, because it's a different thing. It's a sort of like algorithmic alphabetization, if you like, for trade unions and workers themselves.
All right, thanks a lot. That's indeed concrete. So it's about investment, which I think is indeed a very important complement to regulation. We have to skip the question part because we really have to move on. I also don't want to cut into the break. But let me give the final word to Agnes, perhaps to close the panel, and also to respond to the panelists. And yeah, to kind of like flesh out the way forward.
And flesh out the way forward is just winning elections. Huh? That would really be helpful, because Ursula von der Leyen didn't come up with the proposal just because she thought this is necessary. She came up with the proposal because she needed the trust of the social democratic family, and therefore she guaranteed that she would stand for minimum wage, for platform workers, for the work-life balance, for women on board, etc., etc. So very important to win the elections. And to win the elections, Daniel is right, we have to look into the fear of people. And let me then just make one remark in the more general sense. I think it was already 3 years ago that the biggest Dutch bank made a survey on platformization of our economy. Because let's say if you don't live in Amsterdam or Utrecht, what do you know about the Ubers or the Deliveroo's of this world? If you live in the east part of the country, you just go yourself to a restaurant and pick up your meals if you want to have them. But they said in the study that a sector as the retail sector, or the taking care of the elderly sector, or the cleaning sector could all be arranged via a platform, because if using a computer and an app is enough to strip people from their labor rights, it's very challenging not to do so. And then we are not talking about a few thousand people working for Uber or food, but then we are talking about the bottom half of our labor market. And therefore, I think we need to talk more about this, about the dangers of this, that it's not just a few happy students instead of going to the sports school, cycling around through our big cities, but it is a real threat, threatening our labor market and our European social model. So let's talk about it and let's win the elections. I think these are the two main messages I want to give before ending the panel. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Agnes, and thanks a lot to the panelists. Final remarks from my side. Indeed, what I take home is indeed we need stronger rules for all workers on algorithmic management. This has to be made concrete at the national level, at the local level, where workers have influence collectively. And second, you mentioned apps, and that if an app can somehow lead to the fact that workers are stripped of their rights, that means that we really need to look at the technology and the design of the technology. And that's also exactly what you said. And I think this is crucial because, and it's not me, it's Langdon Winner who said that, is that if we have specific ideas of the good life, if we have specific ideas of how our society should look like, and in Europe, that's a bit different from the US. It's strong worker protections, strong collective rights, then that means that we need different technology to make those rights concrete. And last month, I spoke to somebody from the US, actually, closed door, and they said, yeah, we're surprised that you're so surprised that your workers' rights in the platform economy are so difficult to make whole, because that's exactly how we designed it in the US, because we don't have workers' rights like that. So it's not a bug of the system, it's a feature. So I think this is also a key thing that I take home, and I think it's really something to look at for the future. Thanks a lot to the panelists, thanks a lot to the audience, also online. A few housekeeping remarks. We have now a very short break, and then we split into 2 parallel sessions